The thing about King of the Hill is that making a scandals video about it requires a certain amount of creative latitude with the word scandal. This is not Family Guy, it's not South Park. It's not a show that was built around controversy or one that spent 13 seasons generating lawsuits, provoking government regulators, and carefully engineering outrages for the sake of ratings. King of the Hill is a show about a man named Hank Hill, who sells propane and propane accessories in a fictional Texas suburb called A.R. Len, and who considers a well-maintained lawn a genuine moral achievement. He drinks Alamo beer in the alley behind his house with 3 friends. He worries about whether Bobby is going to turn out right. He believes in doing things properly without complaining about it. The show premiered on Fox in January 1997, ran for 13 seasons and 259 episodes, won 2 Emmy Awards, and was, for the majority of its run, probably the quietest and most decent animated series on the network. And yet, sit with its history for long enough and you find that quite a lot happened to this show and around it, and because of decisions that were made about it. Episodes the creators themselves delayed by 2 full seasons because the content felt too dark for where the show was at the time. Episodes pulled from syndication after real-world tragedies made them suddenly feel wrong to air. A network cancellation in 2008 that looks, on the actual numbers, rather difficult to defend. A cast that, in the 15 years between the show ending and the revival arriving, was touched by loss in ways that accumulated into something genuinely sad. There's also an internet legend about a meat hook. We will get there. Part of what makes the King of the Hill story interesting, I think, is the show's specific position in the landscape of American animation. The show ran on Fox alongside The Simpsons and later alongside Family Guy and American Dad. These are shows that operated through noise and controversy and deliberate provocation. King of the Hill was doing something completely different. It was making a case for a kind of life, small town, working class, tradition-minded, that American television was not, at that time, much interested in treating seriously. The show did not mock that life. It did not ironize it. It found it worth depicting with care. And in doing so, it occupied a space that is genuinely unusual in the history of American animated comedy. None of what we're covering tonight is the kind of history that generates breathless headlines. There is no federal copyright trial here, no confrontation with a sitting politician on live television, no episode that made the FCC send a formal letter of inquiry. What there is instead is a quieter kind of record. The record of a show that mostly kept its head down, told honest stories about a specific kind of American life, and still managed to accumulate a full evening's worth of things worth talking about. I find that interesting, personally. I have always thought the history around a show tells you something about what the show was actually doing. And King of the Hill's history, the delays and the pull-downs and the strange cancellation and the cast losses and the long wait to come back, reads to me as a version of the same thing the show itself was always doing, which was taking ordinary life seriously without making a fuss about it. So, starting from the mid-1990s, when a man who'd made his name with 2 idiots grunting at music videos somehow convinced Fox to fund a quiet family drama set in suburban Texas, through to August 2025. Loosely chronological. Each section is self-contained, so if you drift off somewhere during the Pygmalion discussion and surface again during the Tom Petty part, that's more than fine. That is rather the point. If you haven't subscribed and you'd like to, there's a button somewhere on screen, and with that said, let's get into it. In the late 1980s, Mike Judge was living in California and working as an engineer. This is not the origin story you would design on purpose for the man who would eventually create one of the most warmly regarded animated sitcoms in American television history. But it's the one he has. He hated the engineering job. He quit. He started playing bass in a band. And somewhere in the middle of all that, he began making short, animated films about 2 teenagers in Highland, Texas, who watched music videos and laughed at them. Those films became Beavis and Butthead. MTV picked it up in 1993, and it ran for 7 seasons, generated genuine controversy, and made Judge a recognizable figure in American animation. Beavis and Butthead was loud and juvenile and deliberately offensive in ways that King of the Hill simply was not. They are, as creative projects, almost complete opposites of each other, which makes the transition Judge made between them all the more interesting to think about. He had grown up partly in Albuquerque and partly in North Texas in a suburb of Dallas called Garland. Garland is, by most accounts, an ordinary place. Not dramatically poor, not dramatically wealthy, not particularly famous for anything. The kind of suburb that exists around every major American city in the South and the Midwest, where people mow their lawns on Saturdays and buy their propane from a local supplier and go to the same hardware store they've been going to for 20 years. Judge found that world interesting. He found the specific texture of it interesting, the way people talked and thought and organized their lives around small points of pride and small points of embarrassment. He began developing a show set in a fictional version of that world. He described the fictional town of A.R. Len, Texas, as being based primarily on the Dallas suburb of Richardson and as a town like Humble in the Houston suburbs, while fans often treat it as an amalgamation of several DFW suburbs. The character at the center of it was a man named Hank Hill, a propane salesman and devoted son of suburban Texas, voiced by Judge himself. Here is something worth knowing about Judge's voice work on the show because it is unusual in animated television. The voice of Hank Hill does not sound like a cartoon voice. It sounds like a specific person from a specific place. It is not exaggerated, not comic pitched, not designed to pop. When you hear Hank Hill speaking, you hear a man. This was deliberate. The show's whole aesthetic project required that Hank be a real person rather than a cartoon character. And Judge's performance, steady, earnest, occasionally stiff in the way that people who care deeply about saying the right thing sometimes are, is central to that. The pilot episode of King of the Hill, which aired on January 12, 1997, follows Hank after a neighbor's daughter makes an offhand comment that is interpreted by a school counselor as evidence that Hank has been abusing Bobby. Hank is investigated. The family goes through a period of external scrutiny that is both genuinely uncomfortable and, by the end, resolved by the community's recognition that Hank Hill is manifestly not the kind of person who abuses his child. As an introduction to the show's world, it is smart. It puts Hank under pressure in a way that reveals his character, his fundamental decency, his difficulty expressing himself, his deep and real love for his son, without requiring dramatic stakes. The stakes are emotional and social, not physical. This is what the show would always be. A friend once described the pilot to me as the platonic version of nothing bad happens, but you feel things. I think that's about right. The show establishes in its first episode that it is not interested in easy jokes. It is interested in the texture of a particular kind of dignity being tested and holding. Fox was interested. And Fox did something that, in retrospect, turned out to matter quite a lot. They paired Judge with a writer named Greg Daniels, who had been working on The Simpsons. Daniels brought a structural sensibility to the show that complemented what Judge was doing intuitively. Between the two of them, Judge with his feel for the specific rhythms of Texas suburban life, Daniels with his understanding of how to build a narrative around character, they built something that was unusual among animated sitcoms at the time. King of the Hill premiered as a mid-season replacement on Fox on January 12, 1997, in the slot after The Simpsons and The X-Files. Those were two of the biggest shows on American television at the time. Getting that slot for a brand new show was a significant piece of scheduling luck. The premiere drew a large audience and the show was quickly renewed. But here is what strikes me about the early reception, looking back. The show wasn't praised the way you'd expect a quirky animated sitcom to be praised. It wasn't described as sharp or subversive or boundary-pushing. It was praised for being accurate. Time magazine wrote that it was the most acutely observed, realistic sitcom about regional American life on television. Reviews kept returning to the same quality, that it felt true, that it captured something about a specific way of living that American television rarely bothered to capture. The theme song is by an Arizona rock band called The Refreshments, who wrote a piece called Yahoos and Triangles. It sets the tone for what the show was trying to do immediately. This is not a show about explosion and spectacle. This is a show about the particular pleasures and frustrations of a particular kind of ordinary life. The cast filled in around Judges Hank Hill in ways that helped define the show's texture. Kathy Najimy as Peg E. Hill, Hank's wife. Well-meaning, frequently wrong, convinced of her own intelligence in ways the show treated with more affection than contempt. Pamela Adlon as Bobby, their son, a chubby, aspiring prop comic who Hank spent 13 seasons worrying was not going to turn out right. Brittany Murphy, who was 19 years old when she started, as Lou Ann Platter, Hank's niece. And a group of supporting characters, Dale Grib Bull, voiced by Johnny Hardwick, Bill D.O.H. Treve, Stephen Root, and Boomhow R. Judge Again, who became, over the run of the show, some of the most carefully observed minor characters in animated television. The show ran around the same Fox Sunday evening block as The Simpsons, and later, Family Guy and American Dad. It was always the quietest member of that group. It never generated the kind of noise those shows generated. Over its 13 seasons, it received 2 Emmy wins out of 7 nominations, attracted an impressive roster of celebrity guest voices, Tom Petty, Chuck Mangie, Oakney, Ann Richards, and many others, and built a reputation as the animated show most likely to make you feel something small and genuine. The comparison to The Simpsons is one that was made constantly during the show's run, and is worth thinking about carefully. Both shows are animated family sitcoms on Fox. Both feature a central patriarch who is sometimes wrong but fundamentally decent. Both have genuine emotional depth under a comic surface. But the shows are doing fundamentally different things. The Simpsons, at its best, is a satirical show. It is exaggerating American life in order to comment on it. King of the Hill is satirizing everyday American life and culture, but it does so in a more understated and sincere way than most adult animated sitcoms. It is, as nearly as a half-hour animated comedy can be, simply depicting. A.R. Lynn is not a heightened version of suburban Texas. It is a very careful representation of it. The jokes do not come from the show looking down at its characters or at their world. They come from the show looking very closely at a world and finding, as close observation usually does, things that are both funny and true. This distinction matters for understanding the show's history because it explains something about both the show's audience and the show's relationship to controversy. A satirical show creates distance between itself and its subject that can be mistaken for irony or contempt. King of the Hill did not have that distance. It was closer to its world than almost any other animated show, which meant that anything that happened to that world, anything that happened in the real Texas suburbs the show drew on, anything that happened in the country's conversation about people like Hank Hill, landed differently than it would for a show that was simply making fun. King of the Hill was not a show that went looking for trouble. It was not trying to be provocative. When trouble found it anyway, and it did in various forms, it arrived from outside, usually from the collision between something the show had made and something happening in the world that changed how that thing landed. That is a different kind of history from the one a show like Family Guy has. It is, in some ways, a more interesting one. There is a specific quality to the show's humor worth naming early, because it shapes everything about the history we're covering tonight. King of the Hill is not a cynical show. This sounds simple, but it is actually fairly unusual. Most American comedy, animated or otherwise, operates with at least some detachment from its subject. a knowingness that signals the show is in on the joke, that it does not fully endorse the people and places it depicts. King of the Hill doesn't do that. It genuinely likes Hank Hill. It finds his values interesting rather than embarrassing. When Hank is wrong about something, and he is wrong about quite a few things, particularly in the early seasons, the show treats that wrongness as a real failure in a real person, not as evidence that his whole worldview is ridiculous. When he is right, the show is willing to let him be right. This is a harder trick to pull off than it sounds. Treating a conservative, tradition-minded Texas propane salesman with genuine respect in a primetime animated comedy across 13 seasons required a consistent, creative discipline that did not waver. It also meant the show's audience was broader and more varied than you might expect. People who shared Hank's values watched it and felt seen. People who didn't share his values watched it and found him, despite themselves, sympathetic. The show spent its entire run in a specific middle ground that most television doesn't bother attempting. The four men in the alley, Hank, Dale, Bill, DOH, Treve, and Boomhauer, function as a kind of male friendship group that television rarely depicts with any accuracy. They drink beer, they talk about small things. They're not articulate about their emotional lives, but those lives are present in what they do and don't say. Bill DOH Treve, voiced by Stephen Root, is perhaps the most poignant figure in the main cast. A divorced, perpetually depressed man who never recovered from his wife leaving him. His Christmas episode, in which he falls into a suicidal depression and begins impersonating his ex-wife, is one of the more quietly devastating things the show attempted. Boomhauer, voiced by Judge himself, speaking in an almost entirely unintelligible rapid-fire drawl, is treated as fully capable of complex emotional experience despite the fact that viewers can barely understand a word he says. The show always knew what it was doing with that character. One more thing about the origin story, because it is the sort of detail that tells you a lot about how this show operated. At some point during the show's run, Judge and his team created a character called Lucky Klein Schmidt, a redneck figure who would eventually become Luann's boyfriend and husband. A writer in the room, trying to describe the character to the group, said he looked like Tom Petty without the success. Someone, the accounts of exactly who are a little inconsistent, said out loud, "What if we just asked Tom Petty?" They asked. Tom Petty said yes. He showed up, killed at the table red, and then said he would do it anytime they wanted him. He meant it. That is a fairly King of the Hill story, actually. The most low-key possible version of something that could have been a big deal. King of the Hill was, as I said, not a show that went looking for trouble. But now, let's talk about the ways trouble found it anyway. And the first set of examples are interesting specifically because they had almost nothing to do with anything the show had done wrong. In Season 3, the show ran a storyline about an explosion at the Megalomart, a fictional big-box retailer in AR Len that had been causing Hank professional anxiety for some time. The Megalomart had started selling propane at a price that undercut strict land propane, temporarily putting Hank out of a job. And then, in the Season 2 finale and the premiere of Season 3, the Megalomart explodes, a propane accident during a busy shopping period at a place where a lot of people are gathered. A character named Buckley, Luann's ex-boyfriend at the time, dies in the explosion. Hank, who is still inside the Megalomart when it explodes, narrowly survives. The show then takes the aftermath of that explosion seriously over several subsequent episodes, dealing with grief and guilt, and the particular way communities process a disaster. These are, by King of the Hill standards, fairly intense episodes. The Megalomart explosion arc is one of the more dramatically weighty things the show did, and it handles it with a kind of earnest care that the show was always capable of at its best. One episode features Luann struggling with her loss. Another follows Buckley's spirit in a sequence that is considerably stranger than the show usually allowed itself to be. There is an episode in which Bill falls into a suicidal depression around Christmas that is genuinely affecting. The Buckley arc is worth dwelling on for a moment because it establishes something about the show's range that the cancellation story and the internet mythology sections don't quite capture. King of the Hill was, in its quieter moments, genuinely good at death. Not dramatic death, not comedic death, but the specific, ordinary texture of loss. The way people in a community carry the absence of someone who was there and then wasn't. Buckley was not a central character, he was Luann's boyfriend, a recurring presence, someone the audience had a mild investment in. His death has weight partly because the show takes the time to give the aftermath weight. Luann's grief is not resolved in a single episode. Hank's fear about having been at the Mega Low Mart when the explosion occurred is explored in the immediate aftermath. In the two-part Propane Boom, Death of a Propane Salesman, the community goes through the awkward and necessary process of making sense of what happened. This is what real grief looks like, and the show knew it. It is also worth mentioning that the Buckley spiritual episode, in which Luann sees Buckley's angel, is one of the most formally unusual episodes the show ever made, and it was apparently quite polarizing when it first aired. The show was not a magical realism show. It was a realism show. Having an episode that takes a character's religious vision seriously, without either confirming or denying whether it is really happening, was an unusual choice. The show made the choice anyway. It mostly worked. Now, a piece called Propane Boom, the Season 2 finale in which the Mega Low Mart explosion occurs, aired in the spring of 1998. On April 20, 1999, just a few days after the Mega Low Mart storyline had aired, 2 students at Columbine High School in Jefferson County, Colorado, killed 12 of their classmates and a teacher before taking their own lives. It was, at the time, one of the deadliest school shootings in American history. The grief and shock in the Denver area in the weeks that followed was, by any measure, profound. Local television affiliates in the Denver area looking at their upcoming programming made some quiet decisions. Episodes of King of the Hill that involved a public building exploding and mass panic. Specifically, the Mega Low Mart explosion episodes were pulled from scheduled airings and from reruns. Additionally, a separate Season 3 episode about a church being burned down was not broadcast in the Denver area, partly because of the general atmosphere, and partly because it happened to air on the same day as the Columbine shooting. The Bill Suicidal Depression Christmas episode was similarly held from reruns in the area for a period. A couple of episodes from the tail end of Season 3, including one in which Peggy visits a death row inmate and one featuring Buckley's spirit, were nearly not broadcast in Denver at all, though they ultimately did air, and one of them was later credited with having been genuinely helpful to a young woman in the area who had lost a friend in the shooting. I find this interesting for a reason that might not be immediately obvious. The show had not done anything that contributed to any tragedy. It had not made a joke in poor taste or depicted anything that could be reasonably connected to the violence that had occurred. The problem was simply one of resonance. Episodes about explosions at public places and about suicidal depression felt wrong to air, in a specific community, in a specific period of raw grief. The stations made judgment calls, and the calls were not unreasonable. But it meant that a show about propane and suburban life found itself colliding, by pure accident of timing, with one of the most painful events in recent American history. The Denver situation is also worth examining because it is characteristic of what television looks like at its most human. No network executive issued a decree. No sponsor pulled funding. Local programmers, many of whom were people who lived and worked in Denver and had their own feelings about what had happened, looked at their schedule and made quiet decisions about what felt appropriate to put on the air. Some of those decisions were conservative in ways that might not have been strictly necessary. The Peggy Death Row episode and the Buckley Angel episode, which were nearly not broadcast at all, are not episodes that have anything to do with mass violence. But grief has its own logic, and the people making those calls were not being unreasonable. The detail about one of those episodes being helpful to a young woman who had lost a friend in the shooting is one I find worth sitting with. The show, which was being cautiously managed because of its association with violent themes in the immediate aftermath of Columbine, also contained an episode about how a community processes sudden loss, about grief and spiritual bewilderment, and the way people reach for meaning after tragedy. That episode helped a young woman who survived the Columbine shooting after losing a friend. That is not a small thing. This happened again in a different way on September 11, 2001. The same Megalomart explosion episodes, propane boom and death of a propane salesman, were temporarily pulled from syndicated reruns nationwide on that day and in the immediate aftermath. A public building exploding, mass panic among ordinary people, community members struggling to cope with a sudden disaster. That particular set of images was simply not something that television programmers were willing to put in front of American audiences in the days after the attacks. The episodes returned to syndication by October 2001. To understand this decision, it helps to remember what the television landscape looked like in the weeks after September 11. Stations across the country were making dozens of similar calls about dozens of shows simultaneously. It was not a coordinated national policy. It was dozens of programming teams, many of them shaken by what had happened, making individual judgments about what was appropriate to air and when. Comedies that featured destruction or mass violence got held. Action films were moved back from theatrical release. The entire entertainment industry spent several weeks in a kind of collective uncertainty about what was acceptable and what felt wrong. King of the Hill, with its explosion episodes, got caught in that net, along with a significant number of other shows that had done nothing more inflammatory than depict things blowing up. The episodes returned to syndication by October 2001, but for a period they disappeared, and the reason they disappeared had nothing to do with the show's content and everything to do with the world the show was being aired into. And then, in late 2010, a smaller and more local incident, following a string of high-profile suicides among teenagers who had been bullied for being gay, a line in a King of the Hill episode in which a teenage character at a Renaissance fair calls a make-believe king gay as an insult, was edited out of some network airings. The edit came from the broadcasters, not from the show's creators, and it was not applied universally. Adult Swim, which had been airing King of the Hill in late-night syndication, reinstated the original line about 2 years later. These are not taken individually particularly dramatic stories. No one lost a job over them, and no lawsuits were filed. The show's reputation was not damaged. But they are a useful illustration of something that runs through King of the Hill's history more broadly. The show was not operating in a vacuum. It was a piece of television, being broadcast into a specific country at a specific time, and sometimes the country's mood and the show's content intersected in ways that nobody had planned for. The show's response in all these cases was basically to wait. The episodes came back. The world moved on, which is again a very King of the Hill kind of response. But talking a bit about what came next, the next episode to cause any kind of stir was actually held back on purpose by the people who made it. And the story that grew up around that episode is frankly one of the more entertaining pieces of television mythology I've come across. Season 7, Episode 9 of King of the Hill is called Pygmalion, and it is one of the stranger things the show ever made. The episode centers on a man named Trip Larson, who runs a pork products company in AR-Len called Larson's Pork Products. Trip is, on the surface, charming and handsome, and Luan takes a job at his company and finds herself attracted to him. But Trip has schizophrenia, and his behavior throughout the episode is genuinely unsettling. He becomes convinced that Luan is the living embodiment of his company's pork mascot, a cartoon pig girl on the packaging. And his fixation on her escalates into something that is, by the end, a fairly direct threat to her safety. The episode ends on a conveyor belt in the sausage factory, with Trip being fatally injured by industrial equipment and Luann narrowly escaping. It is tonally very different from most of King of the Hill. The show could do dramatic and even emotionally heavy things. The Megalomart arc showed that. But Pygmalion leans into something closer to genuine psychological horror than anything else the show attempted. The darkness is not played for laughs. It is played relatively seriously for atmosphere. Trip Larson is not a comedic villain. He is a person who is suffering from a serious mental illness in ways that the episode does not mock. The show handles his schizophrenia with more care than you might expect from a primetime animated comedy in 2003, which is not to say it handles it perfectly, but the intention is to depict a person whose grip on reality has genuinely broken down, not to play his delusions for cheap comedy. The visual design of the episode is also notably different from the show's usual register. The sausage factory sequences have a quality of industrial menace that the show's suburban settings never quite generate. The episode was directed with an awareness of genre, specifically the thriller genre, that King of the Hill did not usually employ. It is formally a relatively accomplished piece of work. It is just very much not what people expected from the show. Here's the production context. The episode was originally produced during Season 5. Its production code is 5ABE, which tells you it was made as part of that batch of episodes, but the creators held it back. They made a deliberate decision that the episode was too dark, too unusual in tone for where the show was in Season 5. So they sat on it. It didn't air until Season 7, roughly 2 years after it was made. This is, on reflection, a fairly sophisticated piece of editorial judgment. Season 3 of King of the Hill was the season that followed the Megalomart arc, a period in which the show was trying to return to something closer to its domestic core after a sustained piece of dramatic weight. Dropping Pygmalion into that moment would have been jarring, the wrong episode in the wrong slot. By Season 7, the show had a different rhythm, and the episode landed more cleanly within a run of material that had some tonal variety to it. The delay was the right call. When it finally aired in January 2003, it was presented without special context. No disclaimer, no special episode framing, just another entry in the week's lineup. People who were watching the show regularly found it strange. People who had heard it described remembered it vividly. And then the internet got involved. And that, technically, is where the official story ends. The episode aired. It was unusual. People found it memorable. It first aired in January 2003, but there's no clear evidence it kept running regularly in reruns in the years that followed. But the internet had other ideas. At some point in the early to mid-2000s, no one has been able to pinpoint exactly when or where it started. A rumor began circulating online that Pygmalion had originally contained a banned scene. According to the rumor, in the original broadcast, after Trip was killed by the conveyor belt equipment, the camera briefly showed his mutilated corpse hanging from a meat hook in the background of a shot featuring Peggy and Luann talking. The story was that this image had been deemed too graphic for reruns and subsequent airings and was quietly cut so that most people who'd seen the episode had seen the edited version. This rumor spread. It spread on forums, it spread on early Reddit, it spread on Tumblr. People wrote detailed accounts of having seen it as children, of the image sticking with them, of telling friends about it. The accounts were vivid and specific in the way that false memories tend to be, with precise details about exactly which moment in the scene the meat hook appeared, what Trip's face looked like, how long the shot held. A website called Spin Pasta Fandom, which is a wiki for horror urban legends and creepypastas, has an entry about the legend that includes a long narrative account of a man who supposedly tracked down an original VHS recording of the episode in Sacramento, brought his friends to watch it, and saw the banned scene confirmed. The story is written with quite a lot of detail and atmosphere. It is, to be clear, entirely made up, a piece of internet horror fiction that dressed itself up as investigative journalism. The actual resolution to all of this came in February 2022, when a YouTube account called Media Mementos posted footage from what appeared to be an original VHS recording of the Pygmalion episode as it aired. The footage showed the ending of the episode in full. Trip is killed by the conveyor belt equipment. The show handles this primarily through sound, cutting away before showing anything graphic. Peggy and Luann talk. No meat hook. No mutilated corpse. No band shot. The ending of the episode was, and apparently had always been, exactly what the current versions of the episode show. The band scene in Pygmalion had never existed. It was a collective hallucination sustained over somewhere between 15 and 20 years by a community of people who had encountered the episode as children, found it genuinely unsettling, and in the absence of a clear memory of exactly what had disturbed them, filled in the gap with something suitably awful, which is, if you think about it, a remarkably revealing thing to do. The episode was disturbing. It left a mark. And the mind, when it can't quite put its finger on why something disturbed it, sometimes invents a reason. There are several King of the Hill episodes that became associated with similar legends over the years, usually involving scenes that supposedly existed in original airings that nobody can actually find evidence of. The show's tone, relatively realistic, occasionally genuinely affecting, made it fertile ground for that kind of story. It felt like a show that could have done something dark even when it hadn't. What I find genuinely interesting about the Pygmalion myth is how specifically it attached itself to the episode's actual weirdness. The episode really is darker than most of the show. Trip's mental breakdown is handled in a way that was unusual for a primetime animated sitcom in 2003. The ending really does involve a character dying in an industrial accident. The myth didn't come from nowhere. It grew up around something real, something that the episode actually did, and then it embellished that real thing into something that the episode definitively did not do. This belongs to a broader phenomenon. The Pygmalion legend is often discussed in the style of a genre of internet folklore called the lost episode creepypasta. Stories about supposedly disturbing television content that was hidden from the public, suppressed by studios, or accidentally broadcast and then yanked from circulation. These stories are often attached to shows associated with childhood comfort because the contrast between the warm original and the alleged dark content creates a particularly effective uncanny quality. Squidward's suicide, Dead Bart, Mickey Mouse episodes that allegedly drove performers to breakdowns. None of these exist in the forms described, but the accounts of them are vivid and travel widely. Pygmalion is slightly unusual in this genre because it attached itself to a show aimed at adults rather than children. But King of the Hill had the kind of familiarity and warmth that children's television often has, and the episode's genuine tonal strangeness made it plausible as the host for a legend. The Media Mementos VHS footage, when it appeared in 2022, also did something unusual for this genre. It didn't just show the ending as it exists, it provided positive evidence that the episode had always been exactly as we know it. This kind of affirmative debunk is rare. The response from the community that had followed the legend was largely one of relief mixed with mild disappointment. People had, apparently, rather wanted the meat hook to be real. The episode, for what it's worth, holds up fairly well. It's an unusual piece of television, and it was the right call to hold it back from season 5, where it would have felt even more out of place. Whether it needed a meat hook is another question entirely, and the answer is no, it did not. Since we're on the topic of episodes the show made that became subjects of external discussion, let's move to one that actually did get pulled, for reasons that had nothing to do with internet mythology and everything to do with what was happening in the real world in late 2014. Season 11, Episode 10 of King of the Hill aired on January 28, 2007, and was titled The Peggy Horror Picture Show. It is one of the show's more warmly remembered episodes, and for a period after late 2014, it was also one that certain local television stations airing the show in syndication chose to quietly remove from their rotation. The two things are not unrelated, though the connection runs through some territory that requires a little unpacking. The plot of the episode is built on a misunderstanding that suits Peggy Hill's particular character quite well. Peggy is a woman who thinks of herself as sophisticated and worldly in ways the show consistently and affectionately demonstrates she is not. She has large feet. This has been a recurring bit through the show, a distinctive speaking voice, and a confident bearing. When she wanders into a clothing boutique in AR Len that turns out to cater specifically to drag queens, she is immediately mistaken by the customers and staff for one of them. Rather than correct the misunderstanding and leave, Peggy decides she likes these people. She makes friends with them. The group she befriends includes a woman named Carolyn, whose birth name is Jamie, described in the episode as a pre-operative transgender woman who also performs in drag. Carolyn is warm, funny, and genuinely kind to Peggy. The episode's conflict, such as it is, involves Carolyn needing to perform in a drag show and Peggy's involvement complicating the lineup. It resolves with Peggy and Carolyn finding a way to perform together, and with Peggy coming to a genuine acceptance of Carolyn and of herself. By the standards of primetime American television in 2007, this was a fairly progressive episode. The show does not mock Carolyn or treat her as a punchline. The episode's comedic target is Peggy's obliviousness, not the drag community. Carolyn is given dialogue that humanizes her, and the show's ending, in which Peggy accepts and celebrates her new friendship, lands on warmth rather than discomfort. The episode is imperfect in ways that reflect the television conventions of its era. It conflates drag performance and transgender identity in ways that were already considered somewhat confused even in 2007. But the intentions are clearly kind ones. The context in 2014 changed what the episode meant when it aired. On December 28, 2014, a 17-year-old transgender girl named Leela Alcorn from Kings Mills, Ohio, died by suicide. The note she left was posted online and was widely shared. It described years of family rejection and conversion therapy, and it ended with a call for society to fix the problems that had led to her death. Her story prompted an enormous public conversation about transgender youth, about family acceptance, and about how transgender people were represented in media and public life. The particular phrase, "fix society," from Alcorn's note was quoted extensively in the days and weeks following her death. It moved the conversation beyond individual tragedy and into a systemic question. What does it mean for a culture to fail a person like this, and what does that failure look like in practice? One of the things advocates pointed to was media representation, the way trans people appeared or didn't appear or appeared incorrectly in television and film, and the messages those appearances sent to trans viewers about their own lives and possibilities. The Peggy Horror Picture Show was not the primary example cited in these conversations, but it was representative of a kind of episode that advocates had been trying to get the industry to retire, well-meaning, warm-hearted, and fundamentally confused about the difference between identity and performance. In the weeks that followed, some local television stations in the United States that were airing King of the Hill in syndication pulled the Peggy Horror Picture Show from their upcoming schedules. The concern was a specific one. The episode's handling of transgender identity was, by the standards of 2014, noticeably dated. It conflated drag performance and transgender womanhood in ways that community advocates had spent years trying to disentangle. For a young transgender viewer who might be watching late-night syndicated King of the Hill and hoping to see some reflection of their experience, the episode's presentation might be confusing or discouraging. The pull was not universal. The The episode was not officially banned by Fox or by any distributor. It continued to air on Adult Swim and was available on streaming platforms. The individual stations that pulled it did so on their own initiative, and most of them did not make any public announcement about it. It was the kind of quiet, local decision that rarely generates news. What I find genuinely interesting about this episode and its history is the gap between what it was trying to do and how it reads across different moments in time. In 2007, it was a warm and relatively progressive piece of television. By 2014, the same episode had become an example of the kind of representation that community advocates were working against. The episode itself had not changed. The conversation around it had. Part of what makes this interesting in the specific King of the Hill context is that the show genuinely was, by the standards of its era, trying. The Peggy Horror Picture Show is not a mean-spirited episode. The show's creative team in 2007 made choices that were considered thoughtful by the conventions of the time. The distinction it failed to make clearly between gender identity and performance, between being trans and performing in drag, was a distinction that even a lot of progressive media in 2007 did not consistently make. The episode reflects its moment, which is exactly the problem. This is something that comes up fairly regularly in discussions of King of the Hill and LGBTQ representation. The show was, by the standards of its era, surprisingly thoughtful about these topics. There is a season 6 episode called My Own Private Rodeo, in which Dale's father, Bug, who has been estranged from him for years, turns out to be gay and performing on the gay rodeo circuit. The episode's resolution, in which Dale processes this information and decides his friendship with Bug is more important than his discomfort, is handled with genuine care. Dale's specific reasoning, he becomes convinced Bug is a federal agent, and in a burst of paranoid righteousness tries to expose him at the gay rodeo despite spending the entire show certain the government is surveilling him, is both funny and oddly touching. It is one of the more affecting things the show did in its middle seasons. By the standards of its era, is doing a lot of work in those sentences. The show was made between 1997 and 2009, and some of what it did with these topics reflects the particular limitations of that period in American television. The critical response to these episodes has shifted over the years in ways that tell you as much about how quickly the conversation moved as about what the show was doing. That shift is not a criticism of people who loved these episodes in 2007. It is just what happens when the cultural context changes faster than the archive can update itself. The episode is back in full rotation now on Hulu and in syndication. It is available if you want to watch it. The period in which some stations pulled it was relatively brief, and it never involved any official distributor-level decision. But it is one of the cleaner examples in King of the Hill's history of an episode being affected not by anything in its content, but by the world catching up with and moving past the moment in which it was made. Now, let's talk about 2008 and a decision Fox made that had nothing to do with episode content and everything to do with what was happening on their Sunday night schedule. In 2008, Fox announced that King of the Hill was canceled. The show was, at that point in its 12th season, it had 259 episodes behind it. It was the second longest running animated sitcom in American television history, a distinction it held behind only The Simpsons. It was averaging around 6 million viewers per week, which was broadly consistent with where it had been for the previous several seasons, and this is the part that makes the cancellation interesting, actually higher than the viewership of at least one other Fox animated show that was renewed at the same time. It is worth having a little context on the history of King of the Hill and Fox before getting to the 2008 decision, because the 2008 cancellation was not the first time the show had been in this position. The show had been under threat of cancellation multiple times over its 13 seasons. Fox's Sunday night animation domination block was competitive, ratings fluctuated, and the show occupied a slot that other programs were sometimes considered for. The show had survived previous near deaths partly because of the loyalty of its audience, partly because the alternatives Fox tried to develop didn't always work, and partly because Mike Judge and Greg Daniels were consistent enough in their output that the case for keeping the show going remained reasonable. A Fox executive in a 2008 TV Week interview said of King of the Hill, "That show has had its last rites read to it several times and keeps rearing its head again." It was almost a compliment. The show had proved itself difficult to kill, and the network had come to recognize this as a quality, even as it remained something they reserved the right to attempt. The co-chair of 20th Century Fox Television at the time was a man named Gary Newman. The interview gives you a sense of the comfortable, even affectionate contempt with which the network regarded the show. They had nearly canceled it before, they were suggesting they might cancel it again, and the tone was almost nostalgic about the show's resilience. What changed in 2008 was not the ratings. The ratings were fine. What changed was the presence of a more attractive opportunity. Fox never publicly explained the cancellation in full. They did not need to. The reasoning became fairly clear from the timing. The announcement that King of the Hill was ending was closely tied to a separate development. Seth MacFarlane, the creator of Family Guy and American Dad, was developing a Family Guy spin-off called The Cleveland Show. The Cleveland Show would follow Cleveland Brown, a supporting character from Family Guy, who had been part of that show's main ensemble since its premiere in 1999. The Cleveland Show would air on Fox on Sunday nights in King of the Hill's time slot. This is the substance of what happened, stated plainly. Fox decided that Seth MacFarlane creating a new animated show was more commercially interesting to them than continuing to air a show that had once drawn well over 6 million viewers a week and had been doing so for several years. No one at Fox came out and said this, but the sequence of events does not leave a great deal of interpretive room. To put the rating situation in a bit more context, in season 13, King of the Hill averaged around 6 million viewers. American Dad, another MacFarlane show that shared the Sunday night block, was averaging roughly 5.9 million viewers in the same period. American Dad received a renewal. King of the Hill did not. There's a case to be made, and people have made it, that Fox was simply not being rational. The show had been declared dead before and survived. It had a loyal audience. It was cheap to produce relative to more visually ambitious animated shows. It had no major controversies associated with it. There was no pressing creative reason to end it. The reason it ended was that Fox found the prospect of a new MacFarlane show more exciting than the continuation of a Mike Judge show and acted accordingly. Mike Judge's response to all of this was, characteristically, fairly measured. He told the Chicago Tribune in 2009 that the show's ending felt appropriate. He did not go on the record expressing bitterness. He said the show had had a good run. He is, by all accounts, a person who does not particularly enjoy making a fuss about things, which is probably part of why his most enduring creative work is a show about a man who does not particularly enjoy making a fuss about things. Meanwhile, ABC. There was a period in early 2009 when sources indicated that ABC was interested in picking up the show. ABC was already airing Mike Judge's other animated series, The Good Family, and had some familiarity with his work. For a few weeks, there was genuine hope among King of the Hill fans that the show might simply migrate to a network that wanted it. In January 2009, ABC's president Steve McPherson gave an interview in which he said he had no plans to pick up the animated comedy. And that was the end of that. The Cleveland Show premiered in September 2009. It received mixed reviews and declining ratings. It ran for 4 seasons, which is not nothing, but which is a considerably shorter and less celebrated run than King of the Hill's 13. it was canceled in 2013. The time slot that had belonged to King of the Hill eventually went back to something else. There is something almost poetic about the trajectory. Fox canceled a consistent, critically respected show with strong weekly ratings to make room for a new show from one of their most commercially successful creators. The new show lasted 4 seasons and was largely forgotten. The canceled show came back on a streaming service and opened to over 1 billion minutes of viewing in its first week. There is a lesson there about the relationship between what a show is worth in the short term and what it is worth over time. I don't think Fox learned it, but then network television is not really in the business of learning lessons of that particular kind, because King of the Hill's Sunday evening slot was regularly preempted by NFL football. The broadcast schedule across the later seasons was in perpetual disarray. In season 9 in particular, so many episodes were preempted that material intended for that season ended up being broadcast in season 10. This had a cascading effect on the show's narrative continuity over the following seasons. By the time the cancellation was official and the show was preparing its finale, Fox did not order any additional episodes, and the April order simply became the show's proper ending. The series finale, To Sirloin with Love, aired on September 13, 2009. It is a good episode to end on. Bobby joins a meat judging team. Hank discovers they share a genuine expertise in evaluating beef, and the final image is of a father and son grilling together in the backyard. The last thing Hank says is "yep," a word that is also clearly about the show. It ends as the show lived, quietly, warmly, with something small standing in for something larger. 4 episodes that had been produced were not aired on Fox at all. Fox simply did not schedule them. They went into syndication instead, airing across a single week in May 2010 on local stations. They are fine episodes, they just never got a proper home. It is an undignified ending for a show that had given the network 13 seasons of reliable television. I think the cancellation remains the strangest episode in the show's institutional history, not because it was dramatic, it wasn't really, but because it is such a clear example of a network acting on instinct rather than evidence. The evidence said, keep the show. The instinct said, new McFarlane thing sounds fun. The instinct won. The fan reaction to the cancellation was genuine, but not particularly organized. There was no DVD campaign like the one that had saved Family Guy. King of the Hill fans were not the type to mount a coordinated rescue operation. There were online expressions of disappointment, critical articles noting the absurdity of the decision, and a general sense that something decent had been treated without the care it deserved. But King of the Hill fans tend to be, appropriately enough, a bit like Hank Hill about this kind of thing. They are not given to public displays, they expressed their feelings and then mostly moved on. What the cancellation did do over time was contribute to the show's posthumous reputation. Shows that end prematurely, especially shows that end for reasons the audience can identify as having nothing to do with quality, tend to be remembered warmly in ways that shows which overstay their welcome are not. King of the Hill had not really outstayed its welcome by 2009. The final seasons were not as strong as the middle run, but the show had not collapsed, and being canceled while still producing decent work contributed to the sense that there was more worth saying. The wait for a revival is not unrelated to the injustice of the cancellation. People wanted the show back partly because they felt the show had been taken from them unfairly. For now, let's move to something that was happening in parallel with all of this, and which shaped the revival in ways the cancellation could not have anticipated. Brittany Murphy was 19 years old when King of the Hill premiered in January 1997. She had been voicing Lou Ann Platter since the pilot was recorded, and she would voice the character for the show's entire original run. Every season, almost every episode for 12 years. In a 2003 MTV Diary clip, she described the role as a blessing from God. She said that returning to record sessions after being away felt like coming home from college, like returning to a family. She said the show gave her a freedom that most of her work didn't. The freedom to be somewhere she knew, doing something she understood, with people she trusted. There is something in how Lou Anne played her sounds that took genuine skill to produce. The character is not simply a ditzy blonde. She is a specific kind of working-class Southern woman. Earnest, easily impressed, with real warmth under the surface obliviousness. She is not, in the show's view, stupid. She is uninformed and sheltered in particular ways that the show consistently treats with affection rather than contempt. Getting that specific quality right, the warmth inside the apparent vapidity, required Murphy to do something that is considerably harder than simply playing a stock type. She had to play a person. She did, every time. It is worth sitting with that for a moment before anything else, because everything else about this story is sad. And the thing that is not sad is how much she loved that job. Brittany Ann Bertolotti was born on November 10, 1977 in Atlanta, Georgia. Her parents divorced when she was 3, and she moved with her mother, Sharon, to Los Angeles as a teenager. She started acting at 13, began working in television in the early 1990s, and had her breakthrough role at 18, playing Ty Frazier in the 1995 film Clueless, a kind-hearted teenager being educated in the ways of Beverly Hills social life by Alicia Silverstone's Cher. It is a performance with a lot of warmth in it, and it made her immediately recognizable. The career that followed was busy and varied. She played a troubled psychiatric patient in Girl, Interrupted in 1999, alongside Winona Ryder and Angelina Jolie. She was in 8 Mile in 2002 opposite Eminem, in a role that required her to hold her own against one of the most commercially dominant musicians in the world at the height of his fame. Which she did. She was in Just Married and Uptown Girls in 2003. She did voice work in Happy Feet in 2006. By the early 2000s, she was one of the most in-demand young actresses in Hollywood, managing a substantial film schedule alongside a decade of regular King of the Hill recording sessions. How she managed those two careers simultaneously says something about both the show's format and her own discipline. King of the Hill was recorded in sessions in Los Angeles, and because it was animated, Murphy's physical presence elsewhere, on location for a film, doing press for a release, did not affect her ability to participate. She could record Luann between takes on other sets, or come in for a few hours during a break in filming elsewhere. The show's format was flexible in ways that suited her career demands. In seasons where she was particularly in demand as a film actress, Luann appeared less frequently in the episodes. In seasons where Murphy's film schedule was lighter, Luann came back to more prominence. Season 8, which featured a number of significant Luann episodes, was one Murphy had specifically requested, according to those involved with the show. She wanted to come back to the character more fully after a period of relative absence. She married Simon Monjack, a British filmmaker, in 2007. Monjack had a complicated background. There were reports of fraud charges and various legal difficulties, including credit card fraud allegations and major debt-related lawsuits, and the marriage attracted significant negative press attention. The couple's Hollywood Hills home became the subject of considerable media scrutiny. Murphy's mother Sharon moved into the house not long after the wedding, which added a domestic complexity to the arrangement that the press found interesting. In November 2009, Murphy left the production of a film called The Caller, which was being shot in Puerto Rico. The reported circumstances were disputed. Murphy denied reports that she was fired and cited creative differences. And in any case, she left the project. She was 32 years old. The King of the Hill original run had just concluded. The orphaned final 4 episodes were still months away from their syndication airings. On December 20, 2009, the Los Angeles Fire Department received a call from the Hollywood Hills home Murphy shared with her husband and mother. They arrived and found Murphy unresponsive. She was transported to a hospital where she was pronounced dead. The cause was cardiac arrest. The subsequent coroner's report listed the cause of death as pneumonia, combined with iron deficiency, anemia, and multiple drug intoxication. The drugs involved were a mix of prescription and over-the-counter medications used to treat flu-like symptoms, including hydrocodone, which had been prescribed to her. The report noted that she was in a physically weakened state, and that the combination of illness and medication may have had adverse physiological effects that her weakened condition made her unable to withstand. She was 32 years old. The King of the Hill family was devastated. One of the final 4 orphaned episodes, The Honeymooners, which aired in syndication in May 2010, was dedicated to her memory. 5 months later, on May 23, 2010, Simon Monjack was found dead at the same Hollywood Hills house. The coroner's report on his death listed the cause as acute pneumonia and severe anemia, strikingly similar to the cause of death listed for his wife. The 2 deaths at the same address 5 months apart from what looked on paper like very similar physiological processes attracted considerable speculation. The Los Angeles County Department of Health looked into the possibility of toxic mold in the house as a contributing factor. The Assistant Chief Coroner, Ed Winter, said there were no indications that mold was implicated. Murphy's father, Angelo Bertolotti, who had been divorced from her mother since Brittany was 3 and had not been a significant presence in her adult life, later made public statements suggesting the toxicology findings pointed to heavy metal poisoning. He engaged private laboratories and made assertions about foul play that received media coverage but were not adopted by any investigative authority. These claims became a recurring element in media coverage of Murphy's death in the years that followed, generating periodic news cycles without any new substantive official findings. In 2021, an HBO documentary called What Happened, Brittany Murphy examined the story in depth. It is a careful piece of work, and its focus is not primarily on establishing an alternative cause of death. Instead, it spends significant time on the way Murphy was discussed during her lifetime. The press scrutiny of her appearance in her later years, the narrative that her marriage to Monjack was damaging to her professional and personal life, the general atmosphere around a young woman in Hollywood who was not managing her public image in the way that was expected of her. The documentary is interested in the gap between who Murphy appears to have been, warm, committed to her work, loved by the people who worked with her, and how she was treated by a significant portion of the entertainment press. It draws no firm conclusions about why the officially established combination of pneumonia, severe anemia, and multiple drug intoxication killed Brittany Murphy, when and how it did. It asks questions about what her life was actually like, which turns out to be more interesting. I would recommend it if this kind of retrospective work interests you, with the caveat that it is not an easy watch in places. Murphy comes through it as someone who, in the years before her death, was being failed by several of the systems that were supposed to be around her. That is a difficult thing to sit with. For the purposes of King of the Hill, the relevant question was always, what happens to Luan? Murphy had voiced the character since the pilot. The character had grown significantly over the course of the show's run, from a naive beauty school student living in the Hills Den to a married woman with a daughter. The arc was a real one. Luann Platter is, across the full run of the original series, a character who develops in meaningful ways, who makes mistakes and learns from them and finds her own footing. The final seasons, in which Luann and Lucky set up a life together and have Gracie, give the character a sense of resolution that feels earned. Luann's development over the show's run was partly shaped by Murphy's own career demands. When she was filming major productions, Luann appeared less. When her schedule cleared, the show brought the character back more centrally. There is a season 8 cluster of Luann episodes that is notably good. Episodes in which she worked at a hair salon, and meets Lucky for the first time. That came about partly because Murphy had asked to be more involved in that stretch of the show. The writers accommodated her, and the result was some of the best Luann material in the series. When the Hulu revival was being developed, the decision about Luann was relatively simple in the sense that it made itself. Murphy was gone. No one involved in making the show was going to recast her. The character would not appear in the new season. Showrunner Saladin K. Patterson described the decision with an analogy he clearly found useful. Sometimes the best way to honor someone's work is to hang their jersey up in the rafters as a show of respect and what they meant to the organization. Lucky, whose voice actor Tom Petty had died in 2017, was also not recast. Neither Luann nor Lucky appears as a speaking character in season 14. Neither is mentioned. This choice was not universally loved by fans, some of whom wanted some in-universe acknowledgement of where Luann was, what had happened to her, where she and Lucky and Gracie had ended up. But the people who made the show understood something that is easy to miss from the outside. Any line of dialogue about Luann's absence would immediately become about Brittany Murphy's death, would pull viewers out of the show and into grief, and would not serve either the story or Murphy's memory particularly well. The decision to say nothing was, in its way, the decision to say everything that needed to be said. Murphy had called the role a blessing. She had said returning to record episodes felt like coming home. The show treated her absence from the revival accordingly. Not with explanation, not with farewell, but with a space that only she could fill, left deliberately unfilled. Let me tell you the Lucky Klein-Schmidt story properly, because it is one of those origin stories that seems too good to be true and apparently isn't. Elroy Lucky Klein-Schmidt was introduced in Season 8 of King of the Hill in an episode called The Redneck on Rainy Street. The character is an unemployed man of considerable ease, philosophically content, who lives off a cash settlement he received after slipping on a puddle of urine in a Costco and injuring his back. He got around $50,000 from that lawsuit. His nickname, Lucky, comes from the incident. He considers the settlement reasonable, the injury a manageable inconvenience, and his subsequent life of unemployment more or less ideal. He is a Zen figure in overalls. The showrunner who helped bring him into the later seasons was John Altshuler, who was running the show in its later seasons. Altshuler wrote the character, and while describing Lucky to the writer's room, said he looked like Tom Petty without the success. Someone in the room, accounts vary on exactly who said it first, pointed out that this meant they could simply ask Tom Petty, so they did. And Tom Petty said yes. He showed up to the table red. By all accounts, he was immediately naturally funny. He understood the character. He had no difficulty finding Lucky's particular cadence, which is to say, very slow and very certain. After the table read, he told the team that any time they wanted him to do it again, he was available. He meant it as a polite offer. It turned out he meant it absolutely literally. Whenever the show needed Lucky, they called Tom Petty, and Tom Petty came. He voiced the character across 28 episodes over several seasons. He was in the season 11 finale, Lucky's Wedding Suit, in which Lucky and Luann get married in the Hill's backyard. The wedding music is provided by Chuck Mangy O.H.Knee, who became a recurring presence in the show as a strange and beloved running gag, appearing in various A. Arlen locations playing his signature flugelhorn, and who performs a wedding piece that incorporates his own "Feels So Good." It is exactly the right choice and exactly the kind of specific, slightly absurd decision the show was always making. Lucky's individual episodes are worth mentioning because they do something interesting with the character that the casting alone does not fully convey. Lucky is not a wise fool figure, or a comedic prop, or simply a redneck for Hank to look down on. He is a man who has constructed a coherent, if unconventional, philosophy of life, and the show treats this philosophy with the same seriousness it treats Hank's more conventional one. Lucky's values are not Hank's values. His relationship to work, to ambition, to the acquisition of money is essentially the opposite of Hank's. But the show allows both men to be right about different things and to be genuine friends despite those differences. It is one of the cleaner examples of what I was describing earlier about the show's refusal to be cynical. Lucky is also a character who, in retrospect, says something interesting about the show's relationship to its own conservatism. Hank Hill is a man who believes in work, in responsibility, in the social compact of doing what is expected of you. Lucky does none of these things. He lives off a legal settlement from a warehouse accident. He has no employment and no evident ambition to find any. By the values, the show ends. He has no employment and shows ambition only when he decides to study for his GED Roach. But the show doesn't treat him that way. It treats him as a man who has arrived at a genuine peace with his life, who loves the people he loves without complication or agenda, and who is, in his own terms, happy. The show finds room for that. Hank finds room for it too, eventually. It is one of the more quietly generous things the show does. Tom Petty's voice made Lucky work in a specific way. There is a quality in Petty's speaking voice, unhurried, deeply Floridian, certain without being aggressive, that suited the character's Zen-adjacent philosophy completely. Lucky says things that would sound deluded or lazy coming from someone anxious or striving. Coming from Petty's voice, they sound like wisdom, or at least like a real position. The casting was inspired, and the episode that introduced the character, with Lucky's long, easy explanation of how he got his name and his money, is one of the funnier things the show did in its later seasons. Tom Petty was in his 60s when he was appearing as Lucky, and by the mid-2000s, High Tom Petty was in his 50s when he was appearing as Lucky. And by the mid-2000s, his position in American music was effectively that of a beloved institution, consistently successful touring acts in America for decades. He had been part of the Traveling Wilburys, a supergroup so absurdly stacked Roy Orbison, Bob Dylan, George Harrison, Jeff Lynne, and Petty that it almost doesn't seem real. His agreeing to voice a recurring character on an animated sitcom was the kind of thing that most people in his position would politely decline. He thought it was fun. He kept doing it. Mike Judge reflected on how Petty came to be involved in an interview with the Chicago Tribune in 2009. "We had all grown up on his music, that unique voice of his," Judge said, "and to have him as the voice of Lucky on King of the Hill was just wonderful. He was always a pleasure to work with. Such a funny guy." Judge's characterization of Petty as a funny guy comes up in other accounts of his involvement with the show. He was not there as a celebrity doing a favor. He was there as a collaborator who clearly enjoyed what they were making. Tom Petty died on October 2, 2017. He was 66 years old. The cause of death was accidental drug toxicity, an accidental overdose of prescribed medications. He had had a hip replacement earlier in the year and had been managing significant PH. He had had a severe hip fracture earlier in the year and had been managing significant pain in the months before his death through September 2017, and was, by accounts at the time, a strong one. He died 3 days after it ended. His death was a shock partly because of the time. He died 7 days after it ended. He kind of figure whose continued existence felt almost structural. He had been so consistently present in American music for so long that the news arrived with the particular dissonance of something that contradicts a basic assumption. Judge's statement after his death: "We had all grown up on his music, that unique voice of his, and to have him as the voice of Lucky on King of the Hill was just wonderful. He was always a pleasure to work with, such a funny guy. He will be greatly missed." Is a warm tribute from someone who had known Petty in a specific professional context and appreciated him in it. The Hulu revival, which we will get to shortly, handled Lucky's absence in the same way it handled Luan's. The character does not appear and is not mentioned. But the show did find one way to acknowledge Petty. In the second episode of Season 14, titled The Beer Story, there is a montage sequence in which Hank and Bobby are working to perfect competing homebrewed beers. The song playing under the montage is Runnin' Down a Dream by Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. It is the first time a Tom Petty song had ever been used within the body of the show itself. The show had used covers and instrumental versions of Petty tracks in credits contexts, but never a straight recording of his voice. The choice was deliberate. It is about as direct a tribute as the show was capable of making, which is to say, not very direct at all, but perfectly clear. I think it is a very nice moment, actually. The show found a way to say something without saying it, which is what it was always good at. The Lucky Story also says something specific about the kind of show King of the Hill was. It is a show in which Tom Petty, 3-time Grammy winner, member of the Traveling Wit, is a show in which Tom Petty, 3-time Grammy winner, member of the Traveling Wilburys, Rock and Roll Hall of Famer, agreed to play a recurring character whose primary backstory is slipping ennui in a Costco. He warmth of the project and the company of people who made it. Tom Petty was not the kind of person who did things out of obligation. And with that said, let's talk about how long it took to bring the show back. The attempt to revive King of the Hill did not begin as a formal project. It began as conversations. Long, recurring conversations over a period of years between Mike Judge and Greg Daniels and various people at Fox, and eventually at other networks, about whether the show should come back, and if so, in what form, and whether the timing was right, and whether anyone would actually watch it. The first public indication that this was being discussed came at a Comic-Con panel in 2011, at which Mike Judge was appearing to promote the revival of Beavis and Butthead, which did return to MTV that year. Someone in the audience asked about King of the Hill. Judge said no current plans existed. He would not rule out the possibility of it returning someday. He moved on. In August 2017, it became public, through trades covering the industry rather than through any formal announcement, that Judge and Daniels had been having conversations with Fox executives about a potential revival of the show. This was reported as preliminary and exploratory, which it apparently was. Nothing came of it immediately. In March 2018, Judge gave an interview to Rotten Tomatoes in which he said he would want any revived version of the show to feature aged characters, an older Bobby specifically. This was interesting because it suggested a particular approach, not a reboot that reset the clock, but a continuation that acknowledged the time that had passed. Bob E. Hill, played from childhood by Pamela Adlon, had by 2018 been a prepubescent K. Bobby Hill, played from childhood by Pamela Adlon, had by 2018 been a prepubescent kid for 13 years. In March 2020, Greg Daniels gave an interview in which he said that he and Judge had a plan for a revival, and it was pretty funny, and that maybe one day it would happen. This was the kind of carefully hedged statement that could mean anything from, "We've had one good idea in the shower," to, "Shh, we are in active negotiations." And it was not clear which end of that spectrum applied. In March 2021, a writer named Brent Forrester, who had worked on King of the Hill, posted a tweet that began, "I am sure Greg Daniels and Mike Judge will murder me for sharing this, but," and then confirmed that yes, a reboot was currently underway and that negotiations were in progress. The tweet caused considerable excitement among King of the Hill fans, a group who had been patiently waiting for about 12 years at that point. Forrester's evident slight anxiety about having said this, combined with his evident inability to not say it, is a very human moment in an otherwise formal development process. The question of why the development took as long as it did is worth a brief examination. The simple answer is that these things always take longer than people expect, and the simple answer is that these things always take longer than people expect, and that animated production in particular has very long lead times. From commission to premiere can take a year or more, meaning that even a show ordered relatively quickly needs time to actually become a show. Account for. Part of the answer is that the post-Fox landscape took time to figure out. When King of the Hill ended in 2009, streaming services as a major platform for original content barely existed. Netflix was primarily a DVD by mail service. Hulu was 2 years old. The ecosystem that would eventually make a King of the Hill Hulu was about 2 years old, having launched in 2007. Ming, one in which a show could premiere to a global audience without needing a traditional broadcast slot, did not exist yet. By 2023, it was the most natural thing in the world for a show with King of the Hill beef. 2025, it was the most natural thing in the world for a show with King of the Hill's audience to come back on Hulu.mf had become, in the intervening years, the streaming home of the original 13 seasons. From November 2018, all episodes were available to stream. This was significant for a particular reason. It meant that King of the Hill's audience never stopped watching. The show was not a nostalgic object that people had to hunt down. It was just there on a major platform, continuously available. New viewers discovered it, old viewers rewatched it. The show's reputation not only held but grew during the years when it was technically finished. By the time the revival was announced in 2023, King of the Hill had accumulated an entire new generation of fans who had watched it on Hulu and then come online to discover that other people loved it too. The demand for new episodes was not the demand of people rummaging in their memories. It was the demand of people who were watching the show right now and wanted more of it. Another part is that Mike Judge is, by his own accounts, not someone who rushes. He makes things carefully and on his own schedule. Beavis and Butthead came back to MTV in 2011, ran a new season, ended again, then came back again later. Office Space was a famously difficult production that took years to get made. Silicon Valley, which he ran for HBO from 2014 to 2019, was in some ways his most sustained mainstream television success, and by the time it ended, the King of the Hill revival was beginning to take a more definite shape. The sequencing of his career suggests a person who works through one thing at a time, and who brings a particular project forward when he has something genuine to say about it. In January 2022, Judge and Daniels announced the formation of a new production company in early 2022. Mike Judge and Greg Daniels announced the formation of a new production company called Bandera Entertainment. El Bandera Entertainment was developing the King of the Hill revival. And while Bandera, Texas, is known as the cowboy capital of the world, the company's name has not been publicly confirmed as a reference to the town, confirmed to be returning. Mike Judge and Greg Daniels, Joe W., the original voice cast was confirmed to be returning, with the main actors back and some supporting roles recast. Who had worked on shows including Frasier and 2.5 Men came Abby Patterson, who had worked on shows including Frasier and The Big Bang Theory, came aboard as showrunner Sting when you think about it. Frasier is, in some respects, a show with a similar DNA to King of the Hill. A sitcom that treats its characters with genuine respect, that is not interested in broad humor for its own sake, that finds comedy in the texture of specific lives. 2.5 Men is less obviously comparable, but it demonstrates a capacity to manage long-running ensemble character dynamics. Patterson was not the obvious choice for a Texas animated show on paper, but the logic of the hire becomes clearer when you consider what the revival needed. Someone who understood how to manage character over long narrative arcs, and who could bring in an outside perspective without losing the show's specific qualities. The creative direction that eventually emerged from the development process was a time jump. Season 14 of King of the Hill would be set roughly 15 years after the events of Season 14 of King of the Hill would be set roughly 8 years after the events of the original series. Several years in Saudi Arabia, where Hank had been working in propane, because of course he had. Now they were returning to AR Len, which had changed in their absence. This is an interesting set of choices, and I find them more interesting the more I think about them. The show's original setting, a specific kind of mid-1990s to late 2000s Texas suburb, with a particular relationship to tradition and to change, had been the source of much of its specificity. A.R. Lynn was a place where certain things were settled, where the rhythms of life had a reliable quality. Coming back to A.R. Lynn after 15 years and finding it changed is a way of doing what the show always did, using the texture of a place and a way of living to say something about how people negotiate the relationship between what they knew and what they find. The decision to age Bobby up is equally interesting. Bob E. Hill, as a child and early adolescent, was one of the great comedic creations of late 1990s American television. Pamela Adlon's performance, and the writer's willingness to make him funny rather than simply childishly annoying, gave him a specific quality that is difficult to replicate. Bobby as an adult needed to be recognizably the same person without being a nostalgic reproduction of the child version. How you do that is a non-trivial creative problem, and the answer the revival arrives at, Bobby as a chef, still funny, still himself, navigating adult life with the same combination of warmth and mild chaos, seems to me like a good one. The production timeline stretched over 2023 and into 2024 and 2025. A first-look poster was revealed online on May 14, 2025. The premiere date of August 4, 2025 was announced at the ATX Television Festival in Austin's Paramount Theater on May 30, 2025, at which Judge, Daniels, Patterson, and several members of the cast appeared. At that panel, they also revealed the updated opening credit sequence, which showed. The updated opening credit sequence for the revival was released by Hulu and showed an adult B.O.B. E. Hill alongside the familiar A.R. Lynn landscape Urrit had taken from the time the original show ended its Fox run in September 2009 to the premiere of season 14 in a yet-to-be-announced future year. Very nearly 16 years, unlike canceled shows that simply disappear, King of the Hill had been continuously available in syndication and then on streaming for most of that period. The show never really went away, it just stopped making new episodes. And then, eventually, it started again. What made the road to the revival more complicated than the timeline alone suggests is something I have been putting off mentioning, because the section that covers it deserves to be its own thing. Between 2023 and 2025, while the revival was being made, 2 members of the original. Between 2023 and 2025, while the revival was being made, 3 members of the original cast died. House. That is, as I said, its own section. Johnny Hardwick was born on December 31, 1958 in Austin, Texas. He studied journalism at Texas Tech University in Lubbock. He graduated, and then he spent about a decade doing something that has nothing obvious to do with either journalism or voice acting. He worked as a bartender in blues bars in Dallas and Austin, Nick's Uptown, 6th Street Live, the Greenville Bar and Grill. He was in rooms full of working musicians and people who'd come out on a Tuesday night to hear them. He built up a particular way of talking and being around people during those years, and it shows in the character he eventually became associated with. He started doing stand-up comedy in 1990, working the Texas circuit. He appeared on a show called The Jon Stewart Show, which was Stewart's first talk show, the one that aired on MTV in 1993 before The Daily Show. He was working clubs in Los Angeles when Greg Daniels saw him perform. Daniels was in the early stages of developing King of the Hill with Mike Judge and was looking for writing staff. He approached Hardwick after a set at the Laugh Factory. The role of Dale Gribb Bull was one of the first things that came together for the show. Dale is Hank Hill's best friend and next-door neighbor, a chain-smoking, conspiracy-obsessed exterminator who wears sunglasses constantly, talks fast, and refers to himself in moments of evasion as Rusty Shackelford. He is certain that the government is watching him. He keeps a detailed record of the conspiracies he believes he has identified. He is loyal to Hank in the specific way that someone who distrusts all institutions will often be loyal to an individual. He is, in his way, a very funny character. Dale is also a character who, in retrospect, aged interestingly across the show's original run. In the mid-1990s, a chain-smoking, conspiracy-obsessed anti-government figure who called himself by a fake name and regarded every official statement as a lie was a somewhat exotic character type. By the time the show ended in 2009, and certainly by the time the revival was being planned in the early 2010s, Dale's worldview had become considerably more mainstream. The show does not, as far as I can tell, know what to do with this entirely. But Dale Gribb Bull, the show's designated eccentric, became over time less and less eccentric and more recognizable. Hardwick was not just a voice actor on the show, he was a staff writer, a story editor, and a producer. He contributed to the show's creative process across its entire run. He won an Emmy with the production team in 1999. This is sometimes forgotten in discussions of the show's legacy, which tend to focus on the creators and the stars. Hardwick was an active creative participant in the thing he was also performing in. He wrote episodes. He was in the room where decisions were made. The character of Dale is partly, in some unquantifiable way, the product of Hardwick's own thinking about what Dale would do and say and be. After the show ended in 2009, Hardwick remained in Austin. Negotiations with Stern over his salary did not go well. He was not cast. Hardwick was brought in, and in an interview years later, he noted that he got the role partly because he did not argue about money. He was not difficult about his contract. He simply agreed to reasonable terms and showed up. Mike Judge, in a 2003 documentary about the making of the show, said that the moment he felt the characters were really working was when he heard Hardwick doing Dale for the first time. The voice and the character had locked together in a way that felt inevitable. Hardwick appeared in 257 of the show's original 258 episodes. An extraordinary Con Hardwick appeared in 258 of the show's original 258 episodes. An extraordinary continuity of presence over 13 years, and a producer. He contributed to the show's creative process across its entire run. He won an Emmy with the production team in 1999. After the show ended in 2009, Hardwick remained in Austin. In December 2018, he started uploading content to a YouTube channel he had created. In September 2012, he started uploading content to a YouTube channel he had created a few years earlier. Mostly song parodies and monologues performed in the voice of Dale Gribb Bull. By the time of his death, it had around 24,000 subscribers. It is a small number in by June 2025, it had around 24,000 subscribers. Something about the degree to which Hardwick had made his peace with being identified with this one character and had found a way to keep performing him on his own terms. When the Hulu revival was confirmed and Hardwick's involvement was announced, it seemed, on the surface, like a simple return. The surviving members of the original cast back together, and Hardwick had in fact begun recording his lines for the new season. On August 8, 2023, local authorities in Austin received a welfare check request for an address on the east side of the city. When they arrived, they found Johnny Hardwick dead in his bathtub. He was 64 years old. No foul play was suspected. A cause of death was not publicly established in the immediate aftermath. And as of the show's premiere in August 2025, a definitive public cause of death had still not been formally released. He had been found in the city where he grew up, in his bathtub, by someone who had been found at his home in Austin after a welfare check requested by someone who had been concerned about him. Found after a welfare check in Austin by himself. That is quietly difficult to sit with. Hardwick was not a reclusive figure. He had been publicly engaged with his work and his audience for years. He had a YouTube channel he updated regularly. He was active in the creative community that had made him. And yet, the fact of the welfare check and the fact that it found what it found says something about the invisible difficulties that surround people in creative industries, particularly in the years after a long-running job concludes and the scaffolding of regular work disappears. I don't know that this is what happened in Hardwick's case, but it is the shape of the story. The response from the show's cast and crew was one of quiet devastation. Mike Judge's statement on Instagram was characteristically understated. "Sorry for everyone's loss. We are going to miss you, Johnny." It was not a flowery statement. It didn't need to be. After the show ended in 2009, Hardwick had remained in Austin and in December 2018. So after the show ended in 2009, Hardwick later started a YouTube channel and in December 2018 began uploading song parodies and character monologues performed in the voice of Dale Gribb Bull Elt about the character. He had performed Dale for 13 seasons and had written for the show. When it ended and he had time to do anything he wanted, what he did was make more Dale Gribb Bull content. On his own, with a camera, for no money, for the people who wanted it. That is not the behavior of someone who had simply held a job. That is the behavior of someone who had found something that felt genuinely his. By the time of his death, the channel had around 24,000 subscribers, which is a small. By June 2025, the channel had around 24,000 subscribers, which is a small number by internet standards, but represented real people there specifically for what only Hardwick could provide. Arson of the Revivals, Season 14 episodes. Initially, reports suggested this amounted to a couple of episodes worth of material. At the ATX Festival panel in May 2025, Judge corrected this. Hardwick, Judge said, was in 6 of the 10 episodes. The 7th episode, Any Give Hardwick, Judge said, was in 6 episodes. 7 onwards, the voice of Dale Gribb Bull belonged to a different actor. 2, from episode 8 onwards, the voice of Dale Gribb Bull belonged to a different actor. Voiced several significant characters in the original run. Most notably, Cotton High-He voiced several significant characters in the original run, most notably Cotton Hill, Hank's abrasive Second World War veteran father who died in Season 8. MMHE also voiced Khan Su Pu Nu Sin, Phone Sr., the Hills Laotian American neighbor.de. He said at the ATX panel that he was not trying to copy Hardwick but was trying to hold on to what he called Dale's Dale-ness. It is a sensible distinction. The voice is not the character. The transition in the show itself is handled without comment. Dale in episodes 1 through 6 sounds the way Dale has always sounded. Dale from episode 7 onward sounds like Dale with a slightly different instrument behind him. The show does not acknowledge the difference in any narrative way. There is simply the character continuing to exist in A.R. Len, wearing his sunglasses, smoking his cigarettes, being wrong about the government. And then 2 months before the season 14 premiere, something happened to another member of the show's family that was of a very different nature. Jonathan Joss had been voicing John Redcorn since season 2 of the original run. The character he played, a Native American musician and masseuse who lives in A.R. Len, and who, in one of the show's longer-running and most quietly sustained jokes, is the biological father of Dale Gribb Bull's son, Joseph, had been in the show since 1998. Joss had taken over the role from the original voice actor Victor Aaron after Aaron died in a car accident in 1996 before any episodes featuring the character had aired. John Redcorn is an interesting figure in the show's fabric. He exists in a kind of permanent irony. He is an intelligent, thoughtful man with genuine spiritual depth, who's also conducting a years-long affair with Dale's wife, Nancy. He and Nancy have a son together, Joseph, who Dale raises as his own without ever appearing to notice that Joseph looks nothing like him. The show plays this situation mostly for gentle comedy. Dale's obliviousness is one of the show's recurring grace notes. But it also gives Redcorn genuine pathos. He is a man who has a son he cannot acknowledge, who is in a relationship that cannot be what he wants it to be, whose life is shaped by a history of injustice that the show occasionally engages with, and mostly holds at a respectful distance. Joss was a Native American actor born in San Antonio. He graduated from Our Lady of the Lake University in 1990 with a degree in Communica. He graduated from Our Lady of the Lake University in 1990 with a degree in theater and speech. Beyond King of the Hill, he built a real career, a recurring role as Chief Ken Hotate in Parks and Recreation, appearances in the 2010 Coen Brothers film True Grit, and the 2016 remake of The Magnificent Seven alongside Chris Pratt. Decades of television and film. Chief Ken Hotate, his Parks and Recreation character, is worth mentioning specifically because it is one of the better examples of a Native American character in mainstream American television comedy from that era. A man who is funny and clearly aware of his own cultural position in a particular way, who uses the discomfort of non-native characters around him as a comedic resource without the show ever reducing him to a simple punchline. It is the kind of performance that takes skill to make a look easy. Joss had already recorded lines for season 14 of King of the Hill before his death. He appears in the second episode. On June 1, 2025, Joss was shot multiple times outside his home in the south side of On June 1, 2025, Joss was shot outside his home in the south side of San Antonio. Tristan Kern de Gonzalez was with him. Joss, according to his husband's later account, pushed Kern de Gonzalez out of the way before he was hit. He was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 59 years old. The suspected shooter, a neighbor named Sigfredo Cheja Alvarez, aged 57, was detained by officers approximately a block away from the scene. Upon being taken into custody, he told officers, "I shot him." He was charged with murder. The circumstances around the shooting were complicated by a longer history. Joss's home had burned down in January 2025, in circumstances that Kern de Gonzalez Joss's home had burned down in January 2025. But fire officials said the cause of the fire was under investigation and did not publicly describe it as arson following more than 2 years of threats from people in the area. The preceding 2 years related to neighborhood disputes. The relationship between Joss and Ceja Alvarez had apparently been contentious for some time. Kern de Gonzalez, in statements made after his husband's death, described what had happened before the shooting as a hate crime. He alleged that Ceja Alvarez had shouted violent homophobic slurs before opening fire. San Antonio police initially said in a public statement that there was no evidence the crime was related to Joss's sexual orientation. The police chief later walked back that statement, describing it as premature, and noting that whether Joss's sexual orientation played a role in the shooting was still part of the active investigation. Ceja Alvarez was indicted for murder by a grand jury. As of the King of the Hill revival's August 2025 premiere, the case was still pending in the courts. The question of whether hate crime sentencing enhancement would apply remained unresolved. Actor Chris Pratt, who had worked with Joss on Parks and Recreation, and on the 2016 actor Chris Pratt, who had worked with Joss on Parks and Recreation, posted a tribute on Instagram. The King of the Hill team, Judge, Daniels, and Patterson, released a joint statement about Joss's death, describing him as someone whose voice would be deeply missed at King of the Hill. I don't have a neat way to end this section because these are not neat stories. Hardwick was found in his bathtub in the city where he grew up, by himself after a welfare check. Joss was shot outside his own home in broad evening daylight, while checking his maid. Jonathan Joss was shot outside his former home while checking his mail by a nearby neighbor. Back with it are a significant absence, and the circumstances of their absences are not the kind of thing that resolves into something tidy. The show premiered 2 months after Joss died. It went on. King of the Hill Season 14 premiered on Hulu on August 4, 2025. The viewing numbers were remarkable and I think surprising even to the people at Hulu who had ordered the show. In the first 7 days of streaming, Season 14 received 4.4 million views worldwide. It became the most viewed adult animation season premiere on Hulu and Disney Plus in 5 years. Nielsen Media Research, which tracks streaming viewership on U.S. television screens, reported 1.208 billion minutes of watch time in the first week alone, making it the second most streamed program overall for the week of August 4 through August 10. The following week, it fell to third among original series with 714 million minutes. The week after that, 567 million minutes, placing fourth. These are not the numbers of a nostalgic novelty that people watched once for old times' sake. These are sustained viewing figures. People kept watching. The show that came back is recognizably King of the Hill and also necessarily something a little different. Hank and Peggy have returned from Saudi Arabia, where Hank had been working in his capacity as a propane professional. They find A.R. Len changed. New development, new neighbors, a neighborhood that does not quite look the way it did when they left. Hank's relationship to his hometown, which in the original series was one of deep, unquestioned belonging, is now more complicated. He is a man who left and returned to find the place moving on without him. This is a recognizably human experience, and it suits Hank in interesting ways. He is not someone who adapts easily to change in the first place. Coming home to find his home has changed without him is a particular flavor of difficulty. Bobby E. Hill is roughly 30 years old and is working as a chef in Dallas. Pamela Ababi Hill is roughly 21 years old and is working as a chef in Dallas. Each is a notable achievement given that she spent 13 seasons voicing a 10-year-old boy. The show's treatment of Bobby as an adult is one of the more interesting things it does. Finding the through lines between the child he was and the person he has become without making those through lines too tidy or too convenient. The episode that attracted the most discussion in the days after premiere involved Bobby in an intimate moment with a romantic partner accidentally making a video call to Peggy. Peggy, hearing audio she cannot see the source of, misinterprets what is happening. The scene is played as a cringe comedy of errors. It is the kind of scene that is uncomfortable to watch in a very specific way that the show is always capable of producing. Not uncomfortable because it is mean-spirited, but uncomfortable because it is true to the specific embarrassments of adult family life. Showrunner Saladin K. Patterson addressed the controversy in several interviews, with an argument that I find convincing. The scene is about the specific experience of parents recognizing that their children are full adults with full adult lives, and of children recognizing that their parents are still, on some level, processing them as children. Many people who have reached adulthood while still in close contact with their parents will recognize something in that dynamic. Some fans found this a satisfying explanation. Others simply found the scene uncomfortable and didn't need an explanation. Both responses seem valid to me. The premiere episode also includes King of the Hill's version of the Fox cancellation callback, a tradition in this genre as noted. Family Guy did it when it came back in 2005. Futurama did it in 2007. King of the Hill's version is quieter and more characteristic. Futurama did it when it returned in 2007 as 4 direct-to-video films. Line and acknowledged irony, a moment of recognition between the show and its audience, and then the story moves on. It's exactly what Hank Hill would do. He might note that something wasn't right. He would not make a scene about it. There's also an Alamo Beer Company partnership, which is entirely on brand for the show and for A.R. Len. The San Antonio-based brewery, Alamo Beer, has been Hank's beer of choice since the San Antonio-based brewery. Alamo Beer has been Hank's beer of choice since the pilot. Released an actual King of the Hill-inspired Alamo Beer in April 2024. The revival features end-of-episode tributes to Johnny Hardwick and Jonathan Joss. The episodes that contain Hardwick's original recordings carry a note of this. The episodes from episode 7 onwards, with Toby Huss voicing Dale, carry the tribute from episode 7 onwards. Toby Huss voices Dale, and episode 6 carries the tribute to Hardwick at its conclusion. Appears as John Redcorn in episode 2. The critical reception to season 14 was warm, with some reservations about specific choices and a general sense that the show had come back intact. Reviewers noted that the revival did not try to be contemporary in a calculated way. It was not filled with references to streaming platforms or social media or whatever cultural moment was happening in 2025. It was instead a show about the same things the original had been about. What it means to belong to a place, what happens when the place changes around you, how people negotiate the gap between who they were and who they become. The fact that these themes read as relevant in 2025 says something about either the show's durability or the persistently unresolved nature of the questions it's asking. Probably both. The time jump specifically was praised for giving the revival room to breathe, rather than picking up immediately where the show left off, which would have rather than picking up immediately where the show left off, which would have required either recasting or ignoring the absences of long-departed supporting characters. The years-long gap gave the show a built-in explanation for why certain characters were not present, without requiring any explicit conversation about it. LE who are there. The people who are not there are simply not there. Dale Grib Bull continues to exist in AR Len, smoking cigarettes and suspecting the government. Hank continues to grill. Bobby continues to be funnier than Hank quite knows how to process. It is, given everything, a generous thing to have made. King of the Hill is not the show you would design if you were trying to generate material for a Scandals video. It never sued anyone. It was never sued by anyone who won. It was never the subject of a formal investigation by a government regulator. It never generated the kind of noise that comes from a creative team that is, on some level, interested in generating noise. It was a show about a man who takes his lawn seriously and loves his family in specie. It was a show about a man who takes his lawn seriously and loves his family in specific, sometimes inarticulate ways. And it tried for 13 original seasons and now one more to tell that story with something approaching honesty. The episodes and urban legends and a network cancellation that made no. There are pulled episodes and urban legends and a network cancellation that was widely debated by fans. There are 2 deaths among the original cast that cast a shadow over the revival. One quiet with an undetermined cause, and one that was genuinely violent and shocking, peeing on "we" in a warehouse. There is Brittany Murphy at 19 years old being handed a character she would May. There is Brittany Murphy at 19 years old being handed a character she would make her own for the next 13 years. Rue, over 1 billion minutes of viewing in its first week. What I keep coming back to, thinking about the whole arc of this show's history, is how much it resembles the show itself. King of the Hill was always a show about people who do not dramatize their difficulties. Hank Hill does not perform his feelings. He manages them. He keeps going. When things go wrong, and things go wrong in AR Len fairly regularly, the response is not to make a scene, but to figure out what to do next. The show treated that quality with genuine respect. It understood that there is a particular kind of dignity in not making a fuss, in simply showing up and doing what needs to be done. The show's history, taken as a whole, has that same quality. The canceled show did not make a fuss. It waited. Its creators kept in touch with each other and with the idea of bringing it back. Wit's creators kept working on the idea of bringing it back and eventually reunited to make the revival happen. When cast members died, the show honored them in ways they might have recognized, not with elaborate gestures, but with quiet tributes, with memoriam cards during episodes, with a Tom Petty song played under a montage, is, when you think about it, rather unusual. Television history is full of shows whose off-screen dramas became as famous as anything on screen. Shows defined by on-set conflicts, by lawsuits, by cast members who couldn't be in the same room. King of the Hill has none of that. What it has instead is a record of people who mostly got along, who mostly respected each other's work, and who, when circumstances intervened, handled those circumstances with as much grace as circumstances usually allow. The show never stopped being the show. Even in the years when it wasn't making new episodes, even through the losses and the long wait, it remained. As a body of work, as a thing people turned to when they needed something warm and decent. Exactly what it had been. I find that admirable, actually. Not because grief requires restraint, it doesn't. But because the restraint, in this case, comes from a real understanding of who these people were and what they would have wanted. Brittany Murphy said the role was a blessing. Johnny Hardwick voiced Dale Gribbull for 26 years across 2 separate runs of the show, appearing in 257 of the original 258 episodes. Tom Petty showed up every time they called him. These are people who gave a lot to this thing. The least the thing can do is carry them with some care. The revival exists. The show came back. It found a very large audience that had apparently been waiting for it, patiently, without losing interest. That is not a small thing, and it says something about what the show was and still is. Anyway, that's everything I have for tonight on King of the Hill. I hope it was a decent companion for however you're spending your evening. If you stayed awake for the whole thing, well done, and I hope you get some rest soon. If you didn't, that's rather the point, isn't it? Until next time.